I'm at chapter 14, which is entitled Tractor by Searchlight. The whole project of using dynamite to find water had been very doubtful from the beginning. Most of the Drumlin hills had springs and soft spots at the side where water might come in smaller or larger quantities. But drilling was by far the most usual method, and explosives were more appropriate for a rocky landscape. But the O management had been panicky, and the foreman believed that Tedeschi could do miracles with explosives. Tedeschi himself had been in the hyped frame of mind that went with explosives, and this had led to a mistake that he was not to realize until it was too late. Normally, dynamite was triggered by a detonator, a little device that created enough electricity through connecting wires to explode a cap. And the shock of this would set off the dynamite. Tedeschi's specialty, however, left over from wartime days, was a slow-burning fuse that would eventually explode the cap under it directly. He had already attached such a fuse to the dynamite charge he had buried under the big rock when the hullabaloo with the pebbles had driven the crew away. Tedeschi had done this automatically and then set out to lay electric wires to a detonator, intending to remove the slow fuse later. He was a dreamy kind of man for whom explosives were a beauty, and moreover, he enjoyed the risks much as a little boy might, having lived dangerously too long in the European War to be content with dullness of life as he found it in the Ontario countryside. Thus it was that under the rock beside which, on the other side, the two girls were in a trance-like sleep, there were not only a large number of charge of dynamite, enough to demolish a two-story building, but there was also a live fuse slowly burning to its inevitable end. George Wiseman was readying his tractor and plough for an evening's work. His homestead was farther along the same escarpment as Scace's Hill, to the west above Caryi, and he had several acres of rough land to prepare for seeding. Evening and night work were his specialty, because he did part-time work for salary every morning and then sold his services for various farming jobs during the day, so that he could attend to his own acres at night. Besides, the quiet of the evening and nightfall gave him an opportunity to think and put together conclusions about the various people he had met and conversations he had had during the day. This evening his thoughts were divided between the missing girls and his chat with Professor Carter about water. He had talked over the disappearance of Linda and Daphne with his wife, and Debbie with his wife, over a brief supper. Thelma Scafe gives those children too much freedom to wander around anyway, said Mary Wiseman. Something like this is bound to happen. I don't know. Kids have generally been pretty safe around here since I was a boy, except for falling into rivers. It's a long time since we had to worry about wolves and bears. Leastwise, I think that, though some figure Andy Small was taken by a wild animal, I never held that. I held that Andy cleared out to live with his cousin in Toronto, and nobody said anything about it, since Miss Small couldn't cope with the children she had left, nor with her no good husband. George, it couldn't be anything like that, but you know very well we still hear wolves around in winter, and we see bear tracks. Wolves don't attack people unless they're railed or starved or rabid. They keep well clear of girls that size. Besides, it's not winter. I'll be afraid of some pervert picking them up. That fat man in green from O looks like the kind of man who'd enjoy pulling down little girls' pants. Mary, you shouldn't say that sort of thing. It's libelous, for one thing. George, has that man been after you about selling? No, not since the latter days sent everyone. From what I hear, Albert and Thelma Scace gave him a run for the money. Just yesterday. Albert has a bad enough temper, but with Thelma and his sharp tongue and all those brains, I'd clear out in a hurry. Just yesterday? George, you don't think Bondworthy would do something deliberate to those children? No, Mary, he wouldn't do that. We've been watching too much TV from Rochester. Modern-day cooks aren't like the Tracy's. They hurt people mercilessly, so as not to be labelled or fooled. They ate on in silence for a moment, and George said, I think it's a natural accident of some kind. What's really strange is that it should happen to two girls as old as that with no news. Well, it's only since noon, really. They don't turn up overnight. It'll be a much greater worry. I must be off now. Get word to me if they want me to join in the search. George had then set out and was soon going back and forth across the field, thinking. Surface water he could understand. He had only to look at the field to see the darker patches where the moisture was to be found. Well, just the same, patches could be greener when the crop grew. What he didn't understand was the reservoirs of water underneath, and how they could be high in some places and low in others. He was still puzzling over this when he thought he saw an animal scrabbling in the bushes near the far edge. As the tractor grew near, the animal didn't run, and then he realized it was a boy. It was Kevin. After his quarrel with his father and his own self-accusations, Kevin had crossed several fields in a small wood without being seen, without being sure where he was going, and was sitting disconsolately on a stone when George came to him. It was a sad sight, the tear marks streaking down his face, his hands dirty and cut where he had carelessly rushed through thorn and scrambled on gravel. What, it's young Kevin. Have your sisters been found yet? No, Mr. Wiseman, I don't think so. The misery was evident in his voice. I thought maybe you'd be out looking for them. I was earlier. You don't think they came this way, do you? No. Would you like to get up beside me on the tractor? Oh, gee, thanks, Mr. Wiseman. Climbed up and the tractor moved off. George was quiet for a while. Guess you folks will be pretty upset till Linda, isn't it? Linda and Debbie come home. Yes. Ever go off like this before, those girls? No. Most silence. Don't suppose they ran away. Might have, said Kevin very quietly. Ever feel like running away yourself? Yes. Used to run away regular myself when I was about your age. My dad was very strict, and I thought I'd reach him, teach him, make him think I was dead. The trouble was he'd wallop me worse when I got home. But it was good feeling free and all on your own, and even good feeling scared. Do you think that, Mr. Wiseman? No. Yes, maybe the girls wanted to feel like free like that too. Well, I don't suppose anybody's strict with them at your house. Kevin was silent. George looked at him, or mean to them. Kevin nodded, tears starting down his face. Well, I guess you didn't really mean to be. Trouble is, I did mean to be. I hated them. The tears were coming faster now. Say now, I can leave this field till later. Why don't we drive down somewhere nobody's looked before? We have the better chance finding them while there's daylight. Yes, Les, if you can take the time. Never too little time to do a neighbor a good turn. He turned the tractor at the end of the field, and they went into the farm lane that led over the escarpment to the field below. It seemed to Debbie that she'd been lying a long time, with Linda cuddling here, looking at the great mountain and wondering at the strange things happening in the sky. For the sky was lighting up with brilliant sunshine, and then darkening to night, sometimes inky, sometimes star-clad, sometimes flooded with moonshine in rapid succession. There was something wrong with the sequence, too. The sun seemed to be rising in the west, and the dawn looked like sunset, and then it set in the east behind that great mountain. Clouds did not move across the sky in any leisurely way, but so fast they streaked, and the girls' minds were dazzled and numbed by the rapidity of change. And there was a gradual cooling in the air. They were warm themselves, but the air was cooler, and more clouds were in the sky, both night and day. It was like lying in bed with the lights off, cars coming across the hill, shining for a moment in the window, and then they disappeared in the distance, and then she drifted off to sleep. Debbie had a special experience as she drifted off to sleep on her own bed on any night. She would see strange shapes in front of her closed eyes, like soft, dark, red worms that swarm in some liquid, and then suddenly the page would turn, all the worms and the shapes turning with it. Another page would be there, but before another page could turn, there would be a shaking of everything in her sight, and she would lose consciousness in a delicious sense of herself, swimming among delightful feelings and tastes, her skin soothed, or appetites met. So it was this strange experience of the reversing day and night, and the friendly menace of the great rock, mountain. She was not frightened. She was waiting for the page to turn and for the shaking to begin. On the hill above Debbie and Linda, and in the ground beneath them, the earth waited silently, as it had since the turmoil of the glacier that shaped it. For far down beyond even the influence of the glaciers, the 100-mile thick mantle that held the internal stresses and smouldering high temperatures of the earth was like a great iron foundation. Radiation of heat could pass up from it, but no tremor of upper movement could pass down through it. Above this, the earth's crust was hardened rock, made in fires of long ago, took various shapes. Here, within 50 miles of the rocky surfaces, it was known as the Laurentian Shield, and that same shield lay far underneath the glacial deposits above. The glacial deposits were pulverized rock, the pebbles, sand, and boulders produced by years of abrasion beneath the glacier and the fire-made rocks of the shield. These, in turn, had hardened under pressure into water-made rocks, sandstone, shale, and limestone. Then the final withdrawal of the glacier to the northeast that carved out the river channels and the escarpments of great rivers like the Trent, and on a smaller scale the drumlins and the moraines that Professor Clark's great interest after compost. In all these were mixed the ground granite, hardened sandstone, reground stone and clay found in layers, clay through which water could not penetrate as it could the looser matter. It looked as though it had been tilled, as it had not by man or plough, but by the glacier. And so it was that the great water reservoirs were underground, as the professor had said. What he had not known was that there was a very large such reservoir under Scace's hill. Normally it leaked into the stream, the Salt River, the Burnley River, the pool by the toy village, and the quicksand in the cattle pasture. As rain and snow waters penetrated the upper ground, the inner sogginess of the Drumlin escarpment could hold no more, and out came the surplus. Some was still coming out, but not at the foot of the hill in the lowland occupied by Triple O. Some inhibiting factor unknown was stopping the usual exits. The boulder by which the girls and the dynamite both slept were deep into the ground, hundreds of feet, a great cliff of rocks snatched from the shield in a raging storm in the glacial age, and above the roots of the rock the gathering water pressed. What held the waters back? At the time, no one even knew they were held back, just that the lowland had dried up. Later, after the disaster, geologists drilled and surveyors mapped. Even witchers came round, but no one was ever found out. But the farmers stopped farming, and the bulldozers began bulldozing. A change came from such descriptive facts. Myths arose, and the superstitions are invented for want of explanation that satisfy the mind. George and Kevin were exploring the lowland that had not dried up, the lowland marsh around the Salt River, separated from the Triple O property by the sand hills and the road concession. George had driven his tractor round the edge of the marsh, and then the two dismounted and walked cautiously among the willows and rushes into clumps of marsh marigold now just past blooming. They called the girls names as they walked and searched for signs of footprints or disturbance. The edge of the marsh was like the field next to it, tussocks of tall grass and scrubby thorn trees, a few cedars and some hardwood. Then they found they were having to look carefully where they put their feet, walking on the tussocks if possible, and watching out for roots of trees. Indeed, as they went farther, the trees grew larger, and part of the marsh was really a forest, intersected with streams and branches of streams and new springs in unexpected places. The size of the trees made it hard for them to get their bodies through, even when they could find adequate rooting. Here there was no sign of human disturbance, and the birds were preparing to go to bed. The night frogs and crickets had not yet begun their chorus. There was a sudden rustling beneath some branches. "Linda," called George. "You there?" "Debbie?" asked Kay. In answer, an owl hooted, whooshed by them, passing just a foot above the farmer's head. Kevin was paralyzed by fear. Then his friend said, "The girls can't be very close if that fellow's flapping around much." And he thought to himself, unless they're asleep or dead. The two pressed on the bushes from which the owl had emerged. There was a bright light ahead of them, lighting up cedars and birches 20 feet above their heads. The sun burst through in a final dazzling brilliance, just before it disappeared behind the escarpment. Night would fall sooner low than the heights. They struggled a few paces, Kevin a bit ahead. Then he whispered, "Look." There was a kind of clearing in the middle of which a piece of cloth was clearly waiting from something. As they came closer, they found there was an almost perfect circle among the trees. In the midst of this was an odd assortment of others. A partly rotted wagon wheel stuck out of the ground, and pieces of a motor car chassis. A cog wheel from some machine, and perched on a partly fallen tree, the half-circle shape of the metal frame of an old tractor seat, wide enough to hold the fat man at the circus, and upended like some arch leading to a new discovery. A rag was caught in the metalwork, idly flapping. The circle, perhaps original, an attempt to dam the river that flowed through the marsh, was no more than a damp patch, picturesque in the woods, obscene if manipulated by thousands and stretching across the land. "No point going farther, Kevin. By the time we got back the tractor, there'll be just time to get you home by dark. No point having the folks worried about you, too. The girls aren't hereabouts." Half a mile or more away, the girls were still asleep. Perhaps the same spell was on them that had once was on the waters beneath them. They were not cold in spite of the advancing dark. The night would be warm anyway, and the trees above them, which did not appear in their dream, sheltered them from the breezes. Even the mosquitoes kept their distance, perhaps because of the odor that was arising from the rock. On the other side, the fields burned on, subject to no spell or witchery, its slow progress marking now an aesthetic chain of cause and event.